and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here back on the campus at HKUST. I think this is probably my fourth or fifth visit to the campus. And first I want to start by congratulating the university, its faculty, and you, the students, in celebrating their 25th anniversary. It really is an honor to be here. We've got a number of events that I'll be participating in, including the celebratory event up in Beijing later this week. And as you heard, Dr. Park and I have already been talking about what other things we can do to collaborate around the Institute for Emerging Market Studies. So it really is a great honor to be back here on the campus and visiting with you today. You know, I've had, I guess, the fortune of taking a look at the previous distinguished speakers list. And I have to tell you that when I was first asked to speak with you, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, what in the world do these guys want to learn about somebody who's been doing tax for 30 years? I mean, you guys are talking to Nobel laureates, you're talking to former secretaries of state, education. There was something on nano generators, which I thought was really exciting. And I thought, I'm going to come and I'm going to talk to you about the prospect for multilateral instrument reform in the global international tax treaty network for at least 45 minutes and see if you guys think that's pretty cool. Lucky for you, I changed my mind. And what I'm really here to do is, I think, to talk to you about the world of work, the world of careers, and the world of change that's happening and that's going to happen, certainly in the next few years. I've been quite fortunate over the last 30 years to have one employer, and that's EY. That's pretty unusual. I would suspect for many of you that will be very unusual in your career. But I think it's reflective of the fact that the world of work is changing quite a bit. And so what I thought I'd do is spend some time talking to you about my career, because it really has been an incredible career. But talk to you also about how the world is changing and the implications that I think exist for each of us as we think about what we do over the course of our working lives and beyond. I'm going to do that in the context of what I call the 4 T's. And the reason I frame it there is because I think fundamentally we have to recognize that the world is being disrupted. It's being disrupted at a pace that none of us have seen. Your generation is going through a level of change in the way that work and business and government and digital and technology is fundamentally altering the way in which the world works. And so we're going to touch on transformation, technology, transparency, and talent. And then I want to talk for a few minutes about how EY is responding to that. We've launched our Vision 2020 just 3 years ago, really in anticipation of these changes, these transformations. And then finally, I do want to talk to you just a little bit about my career, some of the experiences that I've had, and hopefully some advice that I can provide to you where you can take away some things and think about, well, what does this mean for me? What does my life look like going forward? So let's start first with transformation. And in my context, transformation is transformation through disruption, because fundamentally today's businesses, governments, and individuals are really responding to shifts that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years ago. Artificial intelligence and robotics is reinventing the workforce. Drones is ultimately changing the ways in which transportation and logistics are working. We're starting to see driverless cars that are ultimately transforming and will transform supply chain and logistics. And changing preferences and expectations, most notably from you, the millennial generation, I think is altering consumer patterns and changing the demands of everything from how we buy cars to how we use and leverage real estate. And to me, the global financial crisis in 2008 was really a turning point for that world of transformation, because business models fundamentally had to be rebuilt with a completely different view of risk and risk management. Supply chains were truly threatened as companies just disappeared overnight. The world economy got exposed that not everything was working perfectly well. And the effectiveness of governance and oversight by government started to get called into question. Where were they? How did they not prevent some of the challenges that we had? And so what's emerged from the crisis is really an acceleration of business change, where the customer is demanding more and expecting more from the consumer good companies and those who provide them with services. Whereas the society has really raised the expectations on what is good corporate behavior. Where government has often been subject to the whims of democratically elected voters, throwing them out of office in the event that they don't like the way government is handling policymakers. Those types of things are accelerating around the world, in part because of this transformation, because of this disruption. And that, to me, is starting to force an era of transformation where the power of the consumer, the expectation of what is good business, and the accountability of elected governments have all been accelerating. And the primary forces, in addition to that disruption, are what I want to talk about next. Technology, transparency, particularly in a globalized economy, and the changing demographics and evolution of talent and how it's going to affect business. So let's talk about technology, because for me, this is probably the biggest disruptor in the world today. The pace of change is very different than in the past. We've always had advances in technology, right? Business models have had to evolve and have had to change, but in our lifetime, we've seen waves from an IT revolution that were the first the PC, and then it was the internet, and then it was mobile, and then it was social. And now we're starting to see the emergence of artificial intelligence and robotics, right? The Internet of Things. Those types of things are fundamentally happening at much faster pace than we're used to. And technology, quite frankly, is disrupting almost every part of the world. And the speed and the rate of technological change is truly accelerating. So just one point of reference, and there's thousands of them out there, but it took 70 years for the telephone, the landline telephone, for those of you who I know probably don't even know what those are anymore, but for us older people, the landline telephone took 70 years to reach 50 million homes. And the iPad did it in 2. All right, that type of technological change is fundamentally disrupting the world, right? Today, an Xbox, how many of you have Xboxes or something equivalent? The Xbox, nobody has an Xbox? Come on, you guys, huh? You don't want to admit you have an Xbox. Everybody next to you is going to go, oh my God, I can't believe he has an Xbox, right? They're 1,000 times more powerful than the computer that launched the Apollo space mission. 1,000 times more powerful. So in the last 30 years, we've benefited from an amazing advance in technology, right? So driverless cars, something we would have only dreamed about or thought existed in the cartoons, and that's a veiled reference to the Jetsons, but none of you will know of those, to there are real driverless cars all around the world today. And I think that the implications for business are even more dramatic when you start to think about 3D printing. Anybody here seen an actual 3D printer in operations? Yep. Oh, all right. See, I'm in a technology school. Of course you guys have seen them, right? You probably programmed them. The thing for me about 3D printing is it's going to fundamentally disrupt manufacturing. It's going to disrupt supply chain. It's going to disrupt logistics, right? The ability for us to fundamentally change the way in which we distribute, make, and manufacture goods, we're just starting to scratch the surface. And that's going to change and challenge all of us in thinking about the businesses we join today and tomorrow could be disrupted and thrown out of business very quickly because of just that technology change. The third T I want to talk about is transparency. And transparency to me is really unique in that it's happening in a very globalized world. So to me, the trends that will continue to disrupt our existing business models, right, are going to fundamentally happen in public, right? Globalization is happening around the world, but increasingly business is transparent to the customer. It's transparent to the government. It's transparent to the media. And increasingly, it's transparent to the competitors, right? You can't do anything now in a technology space that the competition doesn't know before you've probably even released the product. And so the implication of that is more information is going to be available in the marketplace. And so how business operates, how government regulates, and how the public is treated by products, services, or providers also becomes very public. It becomes very transparent. And so transparency in a global world, just to be clear, is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And there are certain markets, particularly the emerging markets and the world economy, that have benefited from greater transparency. If you look in terms of economic buying power, globalization has fundamentally moved the economic power more from the north to the south and more from the west to the east. Your emerging economies are outgrowing the global economies, and the forecasted growth clearly highlights that this region in particular, the Asia-Pacific region, is going to be the place where the growth happens over the next 10 years. And so in terms of where you're studying, where you want to have your careers, businesses and economic activity are going to happen in this part of the world. And globalization is going to be one of the major considerations. And the thing to keep in mind is that has also led to the rise of a fundamental change in global business. And so if we look at how and where the Fortune 500 sit today versus only 15 years ago in the year 2000, we have seen a 5 times increase in the number of global Fortune 500 that are coming from the emerging markets, right? The emergence of that economic power has fundamentally started to change. And it's going to continue. We're going to start to see more Asia-Pacific companies emerge. But we're also going to start to see the emergence of Latin America, of Africa, as this continued migration of north to south and west to east continues to change the way in which globalization impacts the world's economy. And most notably, China has been a major contributor to economic change as a result, right? China's integration into the global economy has absolutely increased trade. It's lowered the costs of goods and services so much so that inflation globally is basically under control, particularly in the last 25 years. And it's actually also helped to raise the world standard of living. Since 1990, the number of people in extreme poverty have actually fallen by more than 50%. And much of that's happened in the last 15 years. And the rise of the middle class is changing the way in which goods and services are consumed, but also the way in which they're priced, right? And so in response, companies are having to move quicker and faster to deal with the impact of globalization. Now, there's no doubt globalization has its critics, right? Some who say the economic benefits have been uneven. They haven't necessarily fallen across the broad population. But on balance, most would agree that globalization, despite nationalistic tendencies that emerge from time to time in countries and in political debates, globalization has actually been good for the overall world. And I think we're going to continue to see that global trade is one of the impetuses to really try to drive growth. If you take Singapore, for example, I mean, in less than 50 years, it went from a country with virtually no resources, no natural resources, no fresh water to speak of, to today one of the highest per capita GDP countries in the world. And it did it through trade. It basically opened up its economy and said, we're going to help facilitate that. And as a result, people in Singapore have benefited. So I think fundamentally, transparency and globalization will continue to accelerate. The last thing I want to talk about is perhaps the one that at least today you think about, and that's talent and the workforce and what it is that you can look forward to. Because the world today is aging relatively quickly, particularly in our mature markets, and that's going to create all sorts of challenges for global governments. The healthcare systems are under huge pressure, the retirement systems in those markets are under huge pressure. And yet if you compare and contrast that to our emerging markets, we're seeing a fundamental talent dividend start to emerge. Because by 2020, there are only going to be a handful of countries in the world who will actually have more workers than there are jobs. And many of our mature market economies are going to start to see that they run out of workforce, that as people move into retirement, they're going to need to try to find a way to access that imbalance. And fundamentally, this is just numbers. The average birth rate in a country needs to be 2.1 in order to maintain its population. If it's less than 2.1 children, population falls. If it's more than 2.1, population grows. It's that simple. And the fundamental challenge is India and Africa ultimately become the two hotbeds for talent, and almost all of your other markets start to run into challenges. Now, the US on this chart looks a bit unique, and it is, but the US has a bit of a unique advantage that the rest of the mature markets don't have, and that its immigration policies and its willingness to open the gates to immigration, it tends to be able to fix its imbalance faster than most of the other countries because it's still an area where people desire and want to move. So the US economy is not the one that I would look at risk, but over the next 10 to 20 years, these other countries are going to have to figure out how do we either move work to the workers, or alternatively, how do we encourage those workers to move to our markets. And so that change in that talent issue is going to be a big deal. The other thing I think you have to keep in mind is that millennials, your generation, are very quickly taking over the world. That's not a bad thing, right? Huh? Amen. But the reality is that millennials are very quickly moving into managerial roles across the country. In the last 5 years, right, most of the management jobs, and this is mid-level management jobs in China, have been filled by people in the millennial generation, right? That's fundamentally putting challenges to employers to say, how do I make my roles and my jobs more attractive? How do I retain people once they join my organization, right? How is it that I'm able to provide the career that's excitement to the people? And that pivots for me to what we at EY are doing. And so if I could, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how are we responding as an organization. 3 years ago, we launched Vision 2020, which is a strategy for us to say, we have to recognize that we're going to be working in a world that's more connected, more regulated, certainly more diverse, but that's also going to start to need to shift its focus from the mature markets to the emerging markets. We started with the purpose, and for us, that's been the biggest change in our organization, is to really ask ourselves and make certain that we anchor ourselves in building a better working world, right? We help the world's capital markets function better, providing timely and transparent information. We help our clients improve and grow, right, leading to higher standards of living and more opportunities in local economies. We help entrepreneurs get new ideas and products and services to market. We also work on developing leaders who will not only have great careers at EY, but also hopefully move on to industry and academia and government and help economies function and thrive. And we also work to try and strive to serve our local communities, to give back in the places we live. With almost 250,000 people across 150 countries, we really do try to drive our organization to drive the change. But we set out strategic initiatives to say we've got to do more. We hire almost 65,000 people a year. Increasingly, more and more of those are in the emerging markets, and almost 80% of them are your generation, right? It is basically taking the millennials and finding ways in which to integrate them into our business. And really build our business along 3 pillars. First, right, trying to win in the market. And for us, that's about serving our clients well. That's about being connected to what's going on in the world. That's being responsive to their needs. That's being very insightful. That's what we try to build. But more importantly, we've really started to focus on highest performing teams. Because if you think about the cultural diversity that exists in the world today, the best answers come from teams of people working together. Not one perspective, but multiple perspectives. And so embracing inclusiveness and diversity, challenging each other to think about thoughts. We invest heavily in trying to make certain that our teams ultimately work together and respond to our clients. And lastly, we really try to anchor ourselves in what we call strengthening global. That's our brand commitment, but empowering local. Recognizing that at the end of the day, the local market is unique, and each one of them need to be served differently. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my local market representatives and alums from HKUSTs. A number of the EY team here, wave your hands, right? They're the guys in the ties, just like me. But thank you, Agnes, and our HKUSTs, because at the end of the day, right, we invest by bringing in alum and students from all of our universities because local presence matters, right? We fundamentally need to understand culturally how things are done. And for me, building a better working world has been one of the linchpins of how we as an organization have changed and transformed our business. So how is it that a boy who grew up in small town Minnesota, which is where I grew up, ended up here? Let me take you on a quick journey of my career. I started in a very small town, Madison, Minnesota, and actually went to university in northern Minnesota. I'll come back later on who's from Minnesota. Started my career in Minneapolis, where I worked for almost 10 years until I became a tax partner. And then the firm changed my life and asked me to move to Russia. And I was asked to lead the tax practice only a couple years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Came back to Minneapolis to run our Midwest area, and then ultimately moved to Manhattan and became part of our tax leadership in the Americas. I did that for 6 years, and then the firm asked me to move again, this time to London, where I took over and ran EMEA. And then 2 years ago, tax brought me back, and I took over the world. And I love showing this video just because everybody's waiting. Is it finally all going to get colored in? And why did you move to London? It's the only place that doesn't start with an M, right? And the reality is the office in London is called More London. So we think we could call it More London. I'm in More London. So how is it that I got here? Why is it that I got here? Madison, Minnesota is a town of 1,500 people. It is farm community, it is Midwest. My father was a teacher, my mother worked in a grocery store, right? There's no privilege in my family, there's no money in my family. So how is it that I'm leading today's global tax practice? And for me, it started when I was 16, and that was when we had a foreign exchange student come and live with us from Italy. And Lucia was ultimately my big sister, and we got along great. She was 2 years older, and it was great just to see a different part of the world, right? You grow up in Minnesota, everything you know, everything you see is within 10 or 20 miles, maybe 150 miles, that's the max. Anybody here from Minnesota? I'm not expecting hands to go up. Anybody here from the Midwest? All right, there's one, yes. So this is, for me, kind of a moment where I realized the world is bigger than Minnesota, it's bigger than the Vikings, it's bigger than the 66 people that I graduated with. I remember when Lucia left the next summer, and I said, it's been great to have you here. I'm going to come and visit you next year. Yeah, that's great. Tell my parents, Lucia and I have agreed, I'm going to go see her. She's in Milan. I can't wait. I'm going to start saving up my money. Mom and Dad kind of go, yeah, okay, that's fine. We're sitting at the dinner table at Christmas about 6 months later. And my mother brings the mail in, and she puts out this thing from Northwest Airlines, those of you who will know that's now part of Delta. She says, what's this? Oh, I says, my tickets for Italy have arrived. What? I said, remember I told you I was going to go see Lucia next summer? The tickets have arrived. I must have, what do you mean you're going to Italy? I said, well, we talked about this. It's the last summer. Said, well, we weren't serious. I mean, you and I were going to Italy. You're 17 years old. I says, yeah, but I'm the same age she was, and she left for almost a year. I got him, right? They finally said, all right, yeah, you can go. What changed for me was a realization that the world was a lot bigger than the place I had grown up. Now, for you guys, you know that, right? You see that every day. You're here. Many of you were not born in Hong Kong. You go to school. You've traveled. Any of you been on foreign exchanges? Any of you in high school go do exchanges overseas, right? Yes? No? Come on. Everybody's so shy here, right? Okay, so hands have gone up. Look, the reality is that the world has changed. And in my view, what's changed for me has been really eye-opening, and that was a realization that the world was in fact much bigger than where I grew up. And so let me take you back through, since I went through it relatively quickly, my journey, my career. So for the first 10 years after university, for me it was I started in tax, that's what I wanted to do, and I got a chance to work on lots of interesting projects. But for me it was all about building the foundation. It was about showing that I could deliver and showing that I could get work done. Putting my head down, doing a good job, that led to more work, that led to more. I first got assigned to insurance clients, and insurance is a tricky industry, but I started to say, I can figure out the tax rules, I can read the tax rules, but I better figure out how these guys make money, right? How does the insurance business work? And then I got put into some banking, and then I got put into some hedge funds, and then I got put onto a food company, Hormel Foods, that makes Spam and turkey. And I had to figure out each time before I was advising on tax, how do you make money? And it was a lesson for me to realize that if you don't understand the industry that you're working in, if you're in finance or technology or computers or whatever your background and your skill is, you better understand the business you're working for because you'll be more valuable to the company. And so executing, doing a good job, that became a critical takeaway for me in my first formative years. The other thing that happened is probably 4 years in, I got put on a project to help with an airline that's no longer business, Northwest Airlines, part of Delta. And the airline industry is a highly competitive, very capital-intensive industry. And from a tax perspective, right, deciding whether you lease planes or buy planes has major issues from a financial perspective. It has major issues from a tax perspective, and it has huge implications for the finance of the company. So they wanted to do a project where we started to think about tax planning and tax forecasting. And I was the guy who knew how to do stuff in Excel. Or VisiCalc, I can't remember what it was at the time. Lotus 123, perhaps. No, it was Excel. And so I started building a model, and I started at that stage to figure out how important technology was in helping me do my job faster. Suffice it to say, about 3 generations of computers later, we just kept adding more memory, adding more memory, adding more memory. The program started to take almost 20 minutes to run. It had macros that ran for hours. You guys probably can do macros in your sleep. Back then, I was in the book trying to figure out what the hell is a macro, can I get it to do? But the bottom line is we build a world-class model that help the company assess things. And what I took away was, one, Jay, if you don't know how to deal with technology, you're not going to be at the same level as others. And two, if you don't actually figure out how to leverage that into the knowledge of the business, you're going to fall behind. The good news was I delivered the project, and I ultimately became the tax technical guy in that I understood technical rules, but I also understood how to put it into programs. I knew how to program it, and I knew how to then take the data and the output from that to ultimately bring value to our clients. So technology fundamentally became a big eye-opener for me, and that was the foundation that helped set my career in the direction it went. Item 2, global experience. So in 1995, only 3 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, EY had established a kind of an infant practice across Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Ukraine. And I was asked as a first-year partner to go over and help run the tax practice. 25 people, pretty small. And I agreed to it in part, I fundamentally believe, because I had gone to Italy a number of years earlier, and everything worked out fine. The world didn't come to an end, right? Foreign country, I survived. Now, as I drove down the first streets, Tverskaya in Moscow, anybody here from Moscow? Anybody here from, or been to Russia? So I go down the streets, and I see the red star above the Kremlin, which for 31 years, the US media has told me is the evil enemy of the US. And I'm thinking, what in the hell am I doing here, right? I'm gonna do something wrong, they're gonna lock me up, they're gonna throw me in jail, no one's ever gonna see me again. That didn't happen. But what happened to me was I realized the world was global, because every EY client around the world was on the ground in Russia trying to figure out how they could establish and operate the business. And today, the parallels of the emerging markets, what's happening in Asia Pacific, the investments that are coming into China, to Malaysia, to Myanmar, to Thailand, right, is no different. Africa's going to be next, right? Globally, business goes global. And Russia opened my eyes to say, the world is globally connected, you better get with the program. The other thing I realized in Russia was how important cultural diversity mattered. When I got there, there were people represented 30 countries globally from the EY network who were all on the ground in Russia. Australians, French, Germans, Singapore, China, they were from all over the world. So you take a boy who's grown up in Minnesota, only talking to Minnesotans, right? And you drop him into a country where there's the Brits and everybody else, and you first realize sometimes, unfortunately, the stereotypes are true, right? Including around the Americans, right? Outward, bossy, pushy, loud, whatever. But what was more important for me was stereotypes help to inform you that we are all raised differently and we all come up from a different societal background. Some of our countries and upbringings, we are very hierarchical. We don't raise questions, we don't challenge. Others, culturally, you're encouraged to do that. What's important, though, is as you connect and as you find ways in which to work to one another, understanding the cultural differences are there is important. How you react, you control yourself. So let me give you just a quick example. I remember I was in my office, and I used to be a walk-around talk kind of guy, charismatic, talking, hey, how are you? You know, classic, typical American, right? No. So we're not going to stereotype now, right? And one of the senior managers from Russia, she came in and she closed the door, and I'm thinking, oh, this is serious now. So senior managers are in our organization, usually, you know, the next level right below partner, so fairly senior. And she says, Jay, she says, I'm sorry, but I have to tell you something. You can't go around talking to the staff. What'd they do? What'd they say wrong, right? Yeah. And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, she says, culturally, you know, the big boss doesn't do that. The big boss talks to the senior managers talk to the managers, and the managers talk to seniors, and then they talk to the staff, and the staff don't dare come in and talk. So I was kind of violating protocol by even having these conversations. Now, that's cultural, that's historical, that's, in often the Soviet system, and that was the system, so it wasn't a surprise. I said, we're trying to change, we're trying to be different. I said, I'm more used to doing that. She says, well, the other thing you do is you don't talk to everyone. Sometimes you'll only talk to certain people, and that makes the other people feel bad. And I said, so what would you recommend? She says that you shouldn't talk to anybody. I said, how about I do something different? How about when I go and talk, I make sure I talk to everyone? So my response, I have to be sensitive to the cultural awareness. There is it does matter, right? But the response isn't, don't talk to anyone. The response is, if you're going to go out and engage, make sure you engage with everyone. And that's what I did. And I think it's important to realize that cultural diversity is critically important to be successful, but don't get yourself trapped in necessarily responding the way that others might expect you to respond. Be willing to try something different, because embracing that cultural diversity does matter. It really is an important aspect of who you are and how you get things done. So the third section of my career really was a number of leadership roles. And I've been fortunate over the past several years to have lots of leadership roles. And for me, this was always finding ways to connect the dots, to share perspective. But a couple of key things that I learned, and you learn this when you have to lead large teams, is first of all, the power and the importance of influence. Because as a leader, usually it's a big team, it's a lot of people. You can't micromanage what they do every day, right? All you can do is set a desired outcome, and then the key is, rather than tell them what to do to get there, convince them that they can figure out how to do it. And in fact, if you've got some suggestions, make it think it's their idea, not your idea. Now, this is a real art form. But it's important to recognize that as a leader, the power of influence is probably the most incredible and important skill you learn. No one likes to be told what to do, but everyone likes to achieve the outcome that you want. And so in EMEA, when I led that business, I really knew we needed to change our market share and our market position. And so the strategy was move up one position in your market rank. If you're fourth today in Germany, how do you get to first? If you're third today, or fourth in Germany, how do you get to third? If you're second in France, how do you get to first? And then you figure out how to get there, right? I'll send the objective for the outcome, but you let them figure out how to get there. And so that's critically important to understand. I think the other thing, though, that I learned is that when you're in a leadership position, you actually speak with a megaphone every time you say something. And this can be a painful learning for leaders, because once you become kind of the leader, the way in which you interact and the things you tell your people get amplified. If you're critical of a person, the whole organization knows that you've been critical of the person. And so it's important as a leader to really understand that how and what you say does matter. And working with and getting teams to get things done matters in how you treat them and what you say about them. And so for me, it's always been a cautionary lesson to learn on what it is we do differently. I've been fortunate in my leadership years to change roles every 4 or 5 years. So I've never gotten bored in my job. I've always found something different. But I think it's also because I've figured out that I can't control everything, I can only influence it. And I can use the bully pulpit to try to drive strategy and direction, but I ultimately can't control how it is we're going to necessarily get there. Lastly, perhaps, looking ahead, my role today and what I'm doing. And I'll use this analogy in actually a real-life fact situation, which is I do try to think about strategically what's going to happen to our business. So without getting into too much detail in the world of tax, what's going to happen is government is going to become more directly involved and connected to the tax world. And they're going to plug into clients' ERP systems and basically download data, and in many cases do the tax return for our companies. They're going to do it for you as well. Get the information from the companies, monitor your credit cards, look at your bank movements, figure out how much money you made, send you a bill, right? The good news is it actually makes things easier and it does a lot to eliminate fraud, right? The bad news is that it's fundamentally changing the way we today do our business. So I'm trying to think about what is the strategic direction that EY needs to shift to in terms of its tax world. So last year, I did a very long trip. I started in Russia, where I learned more about the Russian income tax system. I then ended up in New Zealand, where they shared with me some tools that they had built, technology-based tools. Australia, a lot of things they were doing on data analytics. They were using GPS systems to actually help companies track where the trucks moved in order to get fuel credits. Right? I went off to India. They were starting to figure out how to use robotics to actually prepare tax returns. I went to Mexico. They were working with the government to try to figure out how to do real-time validation out of their GL systems, right? All real-time, all technology. But at each one of them, I said, have you talked to the guys in Russia? Have you talked to the guys in Germany? They didn't know they existed. And I realized I have a problem. We're investing in all sorts of technological advances and tools, and we don't have a mechanism to share them with each other. And that's going to put us at a disadvantage. Where's my Yammer page? Where's my Google site? Where's my Facebook page that shares all this information? And so we pulled 40 people together for an event where we basically did a TED Talks. We called it the Tax Tech Talks in London, where we got to spend 2 days letting the techies talk to one another, right? No leaders in the room except for me. But what's stunning was how far advanced our people are in technology. I mean, I thought I was good doing Excel spreadsheets, right? But these guys are doing visualization software, linking to Tableau, doing artificial intelligence, figuring out how to build blockchain. The reality is my job today is looking ahead and saying, how do I unleash the power of that potential so that we jump ahead of the competition and we anticipate where the world is going? And ultimately, the challenge for each of you in a world that moves so quickly is understanding the businesses that you work in and how you can do the same. So takeaway advice, closing thoughts on at least things I hope you think about as you and your careers move ahead. I started with the 4 T's. I'm going to end with the 4 E's. And so let me just leave some things for you to think about. First and foremost, if I think back to my early years, it was about execution. How good are you at getting things done quickly? How reliable are you when projects are put in your place? How quickly do you build teams in order to execute and get things done on time the way that we want things? That is the foundational element for your career. The second thing, entrepreneurship. Too often in big jobs and big corporates, we lose the theory of entrepreneurship and innovation, and we kind of rely on how it was done the previous year. Don't fall into that trap. Make sure you understand the businesses that you're working with, but always challenge yourself, can I do it differently? Some of you will go off to be world-class entrepreneurs and start your own businesses. But many of you will work for other people many different times. Bring that creativity, bring that entrepreneurship to what it is you do. That will help you be successful. Third, engage. In a world of technology, one of the challenges that we have is we as a society engage less, right? WeChat is not engagement. It's interesting, it's fun, it's texting, but it's not engagement. I was on a subway the other day in London. I actually took a picture. There were 7 people in a row, all sitting down, all on chairs, and every one of them was looking at their phone and not talking to anybody. Now, if you've been on the tube in London, maybe not. You don't want to really talk to the people next to you. But you've got to find ways to engage personally and not let technology take over your life, because building teams matters, and it's all about connectivity. Learn something about the people on your team, the people you work with. Know something about their personal lives. Know something about what they do for fun. Yeah, you're still going to connect with them on text. You're still going to phone them. You're still going to find all sorts of ways to communicate with them. But don't forget to engage. And last, energy. And for me, this is the one that perhaps is more theoretical, but probably the most important. Every time I go into a group meeting at EY, I always find myself sitting next to the people who I like sitting next to. Why? Because they give me energy, because they're positive, they're upbeat. It's not the world is coming to an end, this meeting is stupid, right? It's about what are we going to do and how are we going to solve the problem. Do not lose sight of the fact that your attitude and the energy you convey to everyone around you matters probably more than anything, right? If you're not excited about something, find something to be excited about or try to find a way not to participate. Because the last thing you want to be viewed of is an energy taker, right? You want to be the catalyst and the energy giver. And that, to me, is the most powerful thing that you can do. As we think about the pivot in the world of work, of what's going to happen from a technology and a transformation, right? Ultimately, the talent that people are going to be looking for in the future are the people who can bring this to the table and help the companies survive and thrive. And so with that, I hope I've shared with you at least some thoughts today on what the future of work holds, how you can be successful, and hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks very much for having me.